so in the show that I'm doing now, the Remember Balloons, you're talking about Alzheimer's, right? Something that can be so hopeless. But then I'm asking, well, where's the hope inside of this, though? So you feel that tension constantly when you're watching my work.
And thank you. And you kind of queued it up a little bit there. Let's talk about the Remember Balloons. Award-winning children's book that's being adapt that you've adapted, and there's themes of memory loss, aging, intergenerational relationships. What was that draw to that sort of subject matter? Because I did an interview in this podcast that I had the opportunity to teach this past summer, and I was talking about being vulnerable in the class and folks sharing their stories and so on, right? And I referenced an interview that I did with Tanya Everett, and we talked about sort of grief, and and having that conversation that's baked into this TED talk she did, called the Grief Dance, and
Mm.
definitely I'll send you the link, but it's one of those things, and it was sort of an interview that I wasn't expecting to have a emotional reaction to. And in the podcast, that was the thing. So, sort of that notion of we all get older and we all have stories, right? We're all getting older. And that notion of your story and maybe forgetting pieces of your story. I don't want to be diving in too deep, but I'm going to give that up to you, but it's just something that I think is a shared thing. But what drew you initially to the story? Because I read about you were also in like a library or a bookstore. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so I didn't plan this. I have two, well, they're not toddlers anymore, but at the time they were 2 and 1 years old. And we used to go, me and my wife used to take them to the local library here where we live every week just to go get more books, come back, read them, go get books the next week. And one week we had been to the play section for like 90 minutes, and I was like kind of getting bored. I was like, all right, we got to go home. I'm sick of being here. So I go to the bookshelf, and I'm like just looking through books, and I come across this one shelf that says children's books about difficult topics. And if you know me, difficult topics, chef's kiss. That's where I'm at. And so I started like flipping through these books. I'm like, oh, this is super cool. And I pull out this white book that's grayscale and has all these colorful balloons on it. And skeptically, I looked at it like, dog, it's balloons. How hard could this be? So I opened it up and I read this story about this little boy named James who has all these memories that are inside his balloons that he holds, which was a really cool concept. And I was like, oh, this is pretty dope. So I keep flipping, and he loves his grandpa. Him and grandpa always tell each other stories. His grandpa has all these balloons. And as you keep going, I'm just reading this story, and he's talking about, oh, his favorite dog, and this one time when he was young, and there was this cow and all this cool stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is really cute. And then this page comes and it goes, but Grandpa's been having trouble with his balloons lately.
Oof. Oof.
And I like all of a sudden, like my hands like turning the pages slower now than it was before. And you see that, him and Grandpa have this shared memory that's silver where they went fishing one time.
Yeah.
And as the story goes, Grandpa starts losing more and more balloons. And all of a sudden, James is like running across the page trying to capture his balloons to bring them back to him, but he can't. And of course, the last balloon he loses is the silver balloon. So he forgets who James is. And by this point, the tears are starting to run down
Yeah.
his face. And so you see this little boy trying to figure out, like, how do you deal with being forgotten by somebody you love? And so he's like trying to figure out, and his parents tell him, look up. And so he does. And there's more balloons than there was at the beginning of the book that he has. And he comes to realize, oh, because Grandpa told me all his stories, I'm now the holder of his balloons.
Wow.
And so the very last page, my favorite point is him. He climbs up into Grandpa's lap, so he's sitting in Grandpa's lap, telling Grandpa about his new balloons, telling him his own stories. I am crying. Rob, I am losing it in this children's section of the library. So I
Oh,
handed it to my wife. I'm like, you have to read this right now. And I'm like looking over her shoulder as she's reading it to see if she's crying too. And she ends up crying. So we pack up the kids, we go home. We start having this long discussion throughout the afternoon and evening about Alzheimer's and dementia.
yeah.
And she goes, you know, I remember the day my grandma forgot me and never remembered who I was anymore. In full context, we're 34 and 33. We've been together since we were 17 and 18 years old. never heard that story before.
Right.
And I was like, what? And I was asking all these questions. And so later that night, 'cause I had toddlers and I wasn't sleeping at the time. It was like 2 a.m. And I was like, I wonder if I can find the author's website. So I just looked up her website, jesseoliveros.com. And then I just go to type to her like, hey, this story's amazing. This is what it did for my family. And at the very end, I was like, would you ever consider letting me turn this into a theater show? Send. Never thought anyone would get back to me.